Thank you for joining us. I'm Kwon Jang-ho. It's been announced that the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is heading back to North Korea. But can he make any progress on North Korea's denuclearization? We'll be trying to break that down with our expert guest in the studio later in the program. But first, let's get the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. This week, we saw the first round of inter-Korean family reunions in 3 years, and today, a second round has begun, bringing together a different set of families. The South Koreans arrived at Mt Kumgang in the north this afternoon, where their relatives were waiting. Let's go to our Park Hee-jun, who's been covering the story for us. Hee-jun, what's the latest?
Devin, the separated families have finally reunited and they're spending time together at the reunion center in North Korea as we speak. These selected 81 North Koreans and their South Korean relatives, numbering 326 people, are attending the group session. We're still waiting to hear from the press pool on the details of the meeting, but it's sure to be incredibly emotional. Remember, this is the first time they're seeing each other since they were torn apart by the Korean War nearly 70 years ago. 2 hours isn't going to be enough, it's going to be too brief, so they'll be making every minute count while waiting for the next opportunity to catch up on each other's lives tomorrow. And after the first round of the reunion, the first day will end with a welcoming dinner hosted by South Korea. In total for day one, they'll have had 4 hours to spend together.
All right, well, did everyone get there safely? The typhoon was right on the east coast this morning, maybe a little too close for comfort.
That's right. It was a very windy and a very wet journey for the South Korean participants who had to travel to Mt Kumgang this morning. There was a lot of rain and a lot of wind in the areas their buses had to pass through, and that meant they arrived at the venue a little bit earlier than scheduled, actually a little bit later than scheduled at around 2 p.m. Many were worried that Typhoon Solek would mean delays or rescheduling. Social Unification Ministry and South Korean President Moon Jae-in also said yesterday that rearranging the schedule for the reunion could be an option if the typhoon became too powerful. But so far, though, it seems like there's no change in plans. The typhoon has already moved into the East Sea, so hopefully the weather will clear up very quickly so that these families can make the most out of their time during the limited time they have together. Back to you, Devin.
Yeah, we do hope that they can do that. Thanks for that, Hee-jun. Now, before the South Koreans left for Mt Kumgang this morning, our Kan Hyung-woo got to meet with some of them and ask how they were feeling, and he sent this report.
The wait is finally over. It's only a brief moment after almost a lifetime of separation. But for the South and North Korean families who thought they'd never be able to see each other again, the reunion is a dream come true. The day before the reunion, we asked the South Koreans who will meet their families living north of the border one question. How do you feel?
감정이 말도 못하지요. 어머니는 지금 며칠 동안 잠을 못 주무셨어요.
사남매가 만나게 되는 그 기분이 이거 말하지 표를 못 그 죽었던 사람 얼마나 반가우면서 눈물이 그냥.
When Oh Byung-im got married at the age of 17, her entire family went to the north looking for work. 74 years later, she will meet her younger brother, Oh Byung-sam. Of course, she has a lot of questions.
우리 동생 내일 만났대. 아이고 또 동생 저기 보고 싶다가 이렇게 만나니까 좋다고. 내가 안 죽고 살으니까 이렇게 만나본다고 하고. 내 어머니가 어떻게 돌아가셨나, 아버지가 어떻게 돌아가셨나. 살은 얘기.
Mo Kwon-sun and Mo Kwon-gu are brothers set to meet their oldest brother in the north. But they're not sure whether the North Korean participant is really their brother because his family name is Kim.
형님인지 아닌지 확인하기 위해서 우리 아버님, 어머니 성함을 여쭤보면 대답을 하실 거 아니에요. 그러면 틀림없는 우리 형이라는 걸로 증명이 되잖아요.
뭐 눈물밖에 더 나오겠어요. 뭐 얘기를 안 해도 우리가 뭐 여기서 남한에서 생활을 하는 거 보면 이북의 실정은 너무나 잘 알거든. 뭐 얼마나 고생을 하고 살았겠어요.
With mixed emotions, the South Koreans will be brought together with their relatives in the north. The 3-day reunion will be buzzing with questions that were left unanswered for close to 7 decades. Kan Hyung-woo, Arirang News.
Now, those families heading to the reunions, as we mentioned, had to contend with rain and wind from Typhoon Solek. But now the storm has passed over the Korean peninsula. It did cause some damage, though, particularly in the southern parts where restoration work is already underway. Oh Soo-young reports.
Typhoon Solek appears to have passed over South Korea, moving out at sea near the east coast city of Gangneung. The Korea Meteorological Administration said Friday the typhoon has substantially weakened after hitting the peninsula the day before. The earlier than expected departure on Friday afternoon has caused most regions to lift their typhoon advisories. Still, authorities recommend locals living in regions along the east coast to exercise caution. The typhoon, with winds up to 126 kilometers per hour, battered the southern and central regions of the country, leaving casualties and infrastructure damage in its wake. Disaster authorities say a woman in her 20s who was swept out to sea still remains unaccounted for, and a man in his 30s was injured on Jeju Island. A 16-year-old boy in the southern county of Gyeong was also hurt on Thursday when a wall collapsed. The strong winds and heavy rain knocked down scores of trees, streetlights and damaged facilities, as well as causing dozens of drains to overflow. Some 22,000 households experienced power outages on Jeju Island and the southern mainland provinces. While the impact of the typhoon was limited in the capital region, local governments have been holding emergency meetings to restore hard-hit areas, launching efforts to mend facilities and identify the impact on the agricultural sector. President Moon Jae-in the day before had called on officials to look into measures like special grants for restoration efforts. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Japan is dealing with its own big storm, Typhoon Cimaron. Hundreds of flights have been cancelled, and it's strong enough that people have been ordered to evacuate. No Adam has this report.
Typhoon Cimarron made landfall in eastern Shikoku on Thursday evening local time, packing winds of up to 175 kilometers per hour and pounding the area with heavy rain. Its strength was equal to a Category 2 hurricane in the Atlantic, but has now been downgraded to a severe tropical storm. Weather authorities say up to 800 millimeters of precipitation could fall until noon on Friday. There have been reports of some power outages, and there is also the risk of flooding and mudslides. There have also been reports of a few people being injured by the strong winds. Meanwhile, transport services have been disrupted. Bullet train services between Shin Osaka and Hiroshima stations were suspended on Thursday evening. More than 300 flights have also been cancelled, and airlines have announced additional flight cancellations for Friday. Typhoon Cimaron is expected to reach northern Japan by the weekend, and more than 100,000 people along the storm's path have been ordered to evacuate. No Adam, Arirang News.
In other news, the U.S. State Department says it'll look into whether South Korea's plans to open a joint liaison office in North Korea would be a violation of UN sanctions. At a State Department press briefing on Thursday, spokesperson Heather Nauert was asked whether there are concerns about South Korea supplying fuel and electricity for the office. Nauert replied that Washington is aware of talks between the two Koreas and that it'll look into the matter further. There are concerns in some quarters in the U.S. that inter-Korean relations are getting ahead of North Korea's denuclearization. On that front, Nauert highlighted comments by President Moon in which he said that inter-Korean relations cannot advance separately from the nuclear issue. South Korea's foreign ministry said Thursday that the liaison office will go ahead since it'll provide no economic gains to the regime, and noting that Seoul is in close consultations with the U.S. so as not to undermine the sanctions. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
When U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last visited Pyongyang, there were hopes that some sort of progress could be made on North Korea's denuclearization process. But it turned out to be a largely frustrating affair, with no new ground gained and a scheduled meeting with Kim Jong-un cancelled upon arrival. Now he's heading back, this time with a new right-hand man for North Korean affairs. Can they get a better return this time, or will it be another false start? Lee Seung-jae has this report.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is set to make his fourth visit of the year to North Korea. He says he's flying there next week to press ahead with talks on getting the regime to abandon its nuclear weapons program. During his first two trips to the north as Secretary of State, Pompeo met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to lay the groundwork for the first-ever summit between the leaders of the U.S. and North Korea. His third trip was a follow-up to the Singapore summit that took place in June. At a press briefing at the State Department on Thursday, Pompeo also announced the appointment of a key North Korea-related official.
I'm excited to announce this morning that Steve Biegun is joining our team as the Special Representative for North Korea.
Pompeo said Biegun will direct U.S. policy towards North Korea while leading efforts to achieve President Trump's goal of the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea, adding the two will travel to Pyongyang together. Pompeo, however, did not disclose the exact date of their trip. Biegun worked on the White House National Security Council from 2001 to 2003 and fills a position left vacant by the retirement of Joseph Yoon in March. Standing next to Pompeo during the briefing, Biegun stressed the importance of his job, adding that the issues will be hard to resolve.
The issues are tough, and they will be tough to resolve. But the President has created an opening, and it's one that we must take by seizing every possible opportunity to realize the vision for a peaceful future for the people of North Korea.
With the latest appointment, hopes are rising that the U.S. and North Korea can edge closer to the agreement reached by their two leaders in June. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Joining us now, we have Dr. GU Myung Hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies to talk more on these latest developments. Thank you for taking the time to come in today.
Thanks for having me.
So it has now finally been confirmed that Mike Pompeo will be returning to Pyongyang next week. And negotiations between the US and North Korea recently have stalled, and they've not been going so well. What kind of progress do you think Mike Pompeo will be wanting to make in North Korea when he goes this time?
So I think the objective of this fourth trip by Secretary Mike Pompeo is going to be the same as his last one, the third visit that took place last month. He's basically going to try to get a firm commitment by North Korea towards denuclearization. So essentially, he would like to see North Korea to provide, the best scenario, to provide a list of nuclear infrastructure, nuclear materials that could be used as a basis for international inspection. But failing that, I think Secretary Pompeo would like North Korea to promise to carry out some of the major gestures they promised to do in terms of inching towards the denuclearization, such as shutting down completely some of the test sites, missile or nuclear. So I think that's going to be his baseline objective this time.
There are also some suggestions that say actually Pompeo's main agenda will be not about denuclearization because they're so stalled on it, but it will be about sorting out the next summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Do you think that could be on the cards?
No, I think definitely there are willingness or like a desire on both sides to have the second summit. Clearly, it's going to be very useful politically for either leaders to meet again and then have this dramatic outcome of seeing them together again in the same room. But then the downside is that unlike the first summit, I think the expectation of the international community is much higher now. If the first summit, the two leaders could get away with just having a meeting, with the second summit, I think the international community would like to see something concrete being delivered out of the summit. But there's not such a guarantee right now. So I think for Secretary Pompeo, the deal or the pressure is that he has to get, this is pretty much his last chance to get something concrete out of the North Koreans. If he doesn't get that, the chance of having the second US DPRK summit, I think it will plummet.
But there's some who say that only the two leaders can really get something and agree on something about denuclearization. And in fact, someone like Pompeo and Kim Jong-un's subordinates don't have the power to kind of make these decisions about denuclearization.
Clearly, that's always been the argument for having a summit, the top-level summit between the two leaders. But we have to remember what happened in the first summit. Going into the first summit, the expectation was that Kim Jong-un would commit to complete denuclearization when, with Trump in the same room, but didn't take place. And President Trump himself, he said that the whole denuclearization process will take a long time, and then the whole process is going to be handled by his subordinate, Secretary Pompeo. So there's no guarantee that having the second top-level summit between the two leaders will lead to anything positive or concrete.
What's different about this fourth trip for Pompeo will be the fact that alongside him, there will be a new man to help him with his negotiations. Mike Pompeo has announced a new special representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun. We've heard a little about him in that report that we just heard earlier, but can you tell us more about what we know and what his role will entail?
Well, so I think there's a little bit of a controversy about his appointment as a special envoy because his background, it sounds like his background is in private sector rather than in foreign policy, but that's not actually the case. Biegun actually studied out as like a policy staffer at the U.S. Congress, more specifically the Senate. He advised senators on the foreign policy matters. Then he moved on to the White House during the President W. Bush years as a staffer for the National Security Council. So in that sense, there's plenty of background in foreign policy arena. The reason why he moved to the Ford company as his second job, so to speak, is a typical example of a revolving door that we observe in Washington. The high-level public service officials, they when they finish their tenure at the government service, they move on to the private sector, and sometimes they come back. So in that sense, the pattern that we see there is not worrisome. But I think what we should be worried about is that Biegun's background is not so much in Asia, but more so in Europe. So the question is whether Biegun would be able to translate his foreign policy experience to the North Korean issue, which actually requires a lot of specific knowledge about the country. So in that sense, I think he'll struggle a bit more than, say, his predecessor, Joseph Yoon.
As you said, his appointment has raised a few eyebrows, and after Pompeo's announcement, the State Department spokesperson was forced to answer questions on why he was chosen. Let's take a quick listen at what she had to say.
Steve, in having served as the head of international relations for Ford Motor Company, as the vice president of international government affairs, knows his way around the block, knows his way around so many of these nations around the world, and has negotiated on behalf of that major auto corporation. And he will take those skills and abilities and apply them to this task.
But why not pick someone who's sat across from the North Koreans in negotiations in the past?
I think he has an excellent pick in Steve, and the secretary's comfortable with Steve, and Steve has his full confidence, and so do we as well.
So we've heard just there, that was the answer, and you've just said that, explained that he does have some foreign affairs experience. But does the reporter not have a point? Why not pick someone who's been part of the negotiations, such as Sung Kim or other previous other experienced heads that they have in the State Department?
So I think the reason why Trump White House didn't pick somebody like Sung Kim or somebody who actually has plenty of experience in North Korea is because I think the current U.S. administration has, I would say, natural instinct of avoiding appointing career diplomats to high-level positions. The part of the reason is because there's, ideologically, they are disinclined to support the State Department. That's the first reason. And second reason is because Trump, because himself, was the president, he comes from a non-policy background. He was a businessman before becoming the president, and he believes the businessmen are the best suited for highly complex negotiations. So I think that's the reason why the White House chose Biegun over other more experienced career diplomats.
The spokesperson in that press briefing also clarified that Pompeo currently has no plans to meet with Kim Jong-un. We all remember last time that he went thinking he would meet Kim, but then they cancelled last minute, and it was rather frustrating for him. How significant is it that this time there are no plans at all from the beginning to meet Kim, it seems? Doesn't that suggest that North Koreans are kind of holding back at this point?
Clearly, that's what he suggests. I think it's a typical North Korean pressure tactic to lower expectations before having a major meeting. But then we have to remember that, if Mike Pompeo has no expectation whatsoever of making progress in Pyongyang, then he wouldn't be making this trip at all. So the fact that he's going to Pyongyang after all means that despite what he says in public, I think he harbors some expectation that he'll be able to make a dramatic breakthrough with North Korea at this meeting, this visit.
This meeting comes ahead of a particularly busy few weeks ahead as well. For example, North Korea is set to celebrate its 70th anniversary of the regime's establishment on September 9th. Chinese President Xi Jinping has been invited for that. And then there's also the Inter-Korean Summit between President Moon and Kim Jong-un. Now, the date hasn't been announced, but they've said it's going to be in September sometime. Also after that, there's the UN General Assembly, and rumours still circulate that Kim Jong-un could be invited to that as well. How much does all these kind of events happening around it complicate things potentially for Pompeo?
And also for North Korea, I would say. I think it's we know there's basically an implicit deadline to all these diplomatic maneuvers between the United States and North Korea. And that deadline is the midterm elections in the United States. So there's a pressure on both sides to bring out something positive, a positive outcome out of all these dealings. And in a typical, if in the ideal situation, all these events, all these high-level meetings that are scheduled to take place will form some sort of victory lap for both sides to celebrate an agreement. And right now, though, the time is running out to reach that agreement. So I think this first visit by Mike Pompeo will say it indicates that it's a Hail Mary kind of move on the part of the U.S. government to get the concessions from North Koreans at the last minute.
A Hail Mary move, but that does suggest if nothing works out this time, that it really could cause problems going ahead for denuclearization.
Of course, the timing, the window opportunity for both United States and North Korea to reach a major agreement on denuclearization started with the summit in Singapore in June, and it probably closes with the midterm elections in November. So we are getting very close to November midterm elections. So October is pretty much the last time that window opportunity for both sides to reach an agreement. That's the reason why I would say that this is a Hail Mary move on the part of the United States.
Let's move on to one more topic before we go. So in that press briefing with the US spokesperson for the State Department as well, another topic was brought up. That was about the joint liaison office between the two Koreas, that was part of the agreement between President Moon and Kim Jong-un when they met in April. South Korea has said for this joint liaison office that they're going to supply electricity and fuel and the like. And reporters were asking Ms. Nawat about whether this would be a violation of UN sanctions. Now, she said that the US will look into it. The South Korean side have said, actually, it's not a violation because this brings no economic benefit to North Korea. It seems that there's some tension between South Korea and the US over this liaison office. How should we how should we view this?
Well, clearly, if you read the UN sanctions measures, unlike our expectation or like our instinctive view of it, the UN sanctions measures are actually quite ambiguous about how to carry out sanctions and what kind of targets there are and all that kind of stuff. So in that sense, the supplying fuel and electricity to the liaison office in Kaesong lies in the gray area. The reason is because, as the South Korean government says, it doesn't really represent a material assistance for North Koreans' economic gain because the scale of the assistance is small. But at the same time, South Korea is definitely providing something that's actually prohibited by the UN sanctions resolution, such as prohibition in supplying of refined fuel to North Korea. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of room for argument in this case. But I think the intention behind the US government's statement that the South Korean government might be violating UN sanctions resolution is because US government, I think, is trying to send a signal to South Korea that it should be refraining from putting Kaesong industrial complex on the table again, because I think the U.S. government is afraid that South Korean government is proceeding towards the reopening of the Kaesong industrial complex.
So you think it's not about the liaison office, but it's actually about the Kaesong industrial complex, which was the big business venture that the two Koreas did back a few years ago?
That's correct. I think if you read between the lines, that's probably the main objective for the U.S. government.
Do you think Korea can really set up this liaison office, though, without the approval of the U.S.?
I think the South Korean government is going to set up the liaison office after all. I think also we mentioned before, the supplying of the fuel and electricity to the liaison office, it lies in the gray area when it comes to UN resolutions, sanctions resolutions. So I think the South Korean government is going to argue that the liaison office doesn't violate the sanctions.
Interesting. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you for coming in today and sharing us your insights as always.
My pleasure.
That's all from myself for this week. I'll be back on Monday with more guests looking at the day's top stories. In the meantime, hope you have a great weekend and thank you for watching. Goodbye.